St. John's Smith Square. I'm James Lockley. It's my delight to welcome you here. The Princeton University Press are the generous hosts of this evening, and there is great gratitude due to them for that, but also for their publication and enormous support of this wonderful book. The most comprehensive biography of Gurney you've got, subtitled by Kate Kennedy, the author, whom I'm obscuring from your view, to whom we should give a very, very warm welcome. It is, for those of you who've had the privilege, as I have, of reading the book. You want me to talk louder? Yes. Usually it's the opposite. Thank you for the prompt. For those of you who have had the privilege of reading the book, which I have, you will know that it's an extraordinary exploration of his life, his tragedy, but his inspiration, and an examination of the way that the circumstances, so painful and so disappointing in so many ways, over so many years, produced such extraordinary work, both in poetry and in music. Kate, as you will know, has subtitled the book Dweller in Shadows, a quote really from those wonderful lines, "And who loves joy as he that dwells in shadows? Do not forget me quite, O seven meadows." What you're going to hear in the next hour or so, 3/4 of an hour, is a conversation between Kate and Stephen Johnson, well known to many of you, musicologist, writer, very familiar voice over many, many years on Radio 3, of course. And we have the privilege of being in the presence of Dame Sarah Connolly, who's going to sing, accompanied at the piano by Simon Ober. Simon, musician, conductor, also founder and director of South Bank Symphonia, the orchestra of young professionals, which has now become a partner with St. John's Smith Square and has merged with this great place and, you know, wonderful music venue, and it will be the home of South Bank Symphonia. So Simon is particularly welcome for that reason, among many others. I'm going to leave you with them now, but Sarah will sing for us, I mean, wonderfully. Kate will talk beautifully, and she will also explain how you can give some help to the centre for which she works at Oxford in a help with its outreach. But for now, I leave you with Kate Kennedy and Stephen Johnson, Sarah Connolly and Simon Ober, to explain, as if you needed explanation, why Gurney matters and why, as this book proves, we should celebrate him today. Thank you for coming. Enjoy the evening.
Thank you, Jim. Now, can you hear me? Is this working? Good. You can hear me at the back? Excellent.
And can you hear me?
Yes. Good. Some composers strive to be original, and some just are. They don't have to strive to be original, and even when they wear familiar musical clothes, you can tell immediately that they're just different. They have a different way of seeing the world, and a different way of experiencing it themselves. And I think Ivor Gurney is a tremendous example of that. And yet for so long, he's dwelt on a kind of shadowy periphery of English musical life. And now at last, it seems, that things are beginning to change. And one marvelous sign of that is Kate's book, which is, overwhelmingly comprehensive. I'm quite astonished at how broad a view she's managed to be able to take of this life and work story, which is one of those occasions where the life and the works are so closely connected, I think, that it's hard almost to extricate.
And I find it a very moving book as well. I was in tears almost at the end of every chapter.
I'm not surprised. It is an incredibly sad story, isn't it? Well, given that, Kate, what was it that drew you to this?
What was it that drew me to Gurney? Well, I've always been very interested in the First World War and this The writer Maddox Ford calls it a crack in the table of history, this moment where the war hits culture, and very often an event that seismic is best explored through the ripples of culture after it. So this has always been an area that I've been fascinated by. But when I began my PhD as a cellist who was doing an English PhD, my supervisor very sensibly said, well, what about writing about Gurney? Never mind women ambulance drivers, which is what I started writing about. What about this problem and also huge opportunity of looking at a huge array of music and of poetry that are written in the same breath. You know, Gurney writes a poem in the morning and a song in the afternoon. Now, how do we think about the way those two acts of creativity link to each other? And who is daft enough to want to tackle that much in the way of difficult manuscripts, most of them undated, and sort of want to actually apply some kind of critical framework to them. And I foolishly, and also not knowing how enormous the project would be at the beginning, thought, well, that sounds like a good idea. That's got my name on it. And here we are 16 years later.
16 years, yes. Well, thank you for being daft enough, that's all I can say. Can you remember your first really significant encounter with the music?
I think, and for the reason that Sarah is going to treat us to sleep first, it was hearing sleep. It was at music college, and I remember walking into a room with a friend singing it, and I mean, just physically being rooted to the spot. And I didn't really know who Gurney was, and I didn't know what this friend was singing, but there was something about it, something about the yearning in it and the restlessness that has, I think, probably shaped the way that I've seen Gurney ever since, because it does, even though he wrote it as an undergraduate when he still had his whole life ahead of him, but he'd already seen darkness and he'd already struggled, and it's built into this song. It is so profound and so beautiful, and that for me, as with many, many other people, is the moment at which you fall in love with Gurney, I think.
Yes, I was at the Royal College of Music. I was a pianist, and I used to take anthologies of song into the basement and play through everything, and I came across Gurney and I thought, wow, this is the most beautiful song, this particular song, Sleep, that I've ever heard. And it inspired me to write an undergraduate essay about it, to find out more about him, and so that was my inspiration. But you're right, Sleep has that magical addictive quality.
Yeah, he
like him.
really hit on something, didn't he? Wonderful.
Well, what better cue, I think, Sarah, for you to
Let's
give us
hear
a rendition. school as some of the other English contemporaries,
Warlock
and Butterworth, and Ireland perhaps, and yet the way it thinks and the way it feels is actually quite different from any of them.
Yeah, he doesn't let you go either.
He doesn't
let
you
you sink into some place of comfort until the very last.
There's no comfort at all. Really.
I mean, one of the things I found really fascinating, you have this sense of the music, and there is the sense of being wrong-footed all the time in the poetry, and trying to put those two together and think about what it is that he does that creates that atmosphere, and then putting the life alongside it, and thinking actually Gurney isn't a very comfortable person. You know, he was Herbert Howells, who's his contemporary, described him as a lovable egotist. He was very intense. Everything was heightened for him, and he would have been great company on some days and terrible company on others. And he would walk for miles and miles and miles at top speed with a friend running after him, and not eat and not sleep. And there's something about his music that is a heightened intensity.
I'd be interested to know what age do you think his mental illness became something apparent, not just to himself but to others?
Well, there was one chap who was at school with him, who Michael Hurd, who wrote a much shorter biography of him in the 70s, described him as having said he was called Batty Gurney at school. Right. But actually it's Gloucestershire for Batchy. I was in touch with his daughter, I think, with his son. And Batchy Gurney, but it does still mean eccentric, kind of oddball. It's very hard to say, but he had something like a breakdown at the Royal College around the time that he wrote Sleep, and he was pulling himself out of it the year before, really. So he went to the trenches in 1915 to cure his neurasthenia. Now that's a high-risk strategy.
But he did, I think, find a kind of purpose and fulfillment, didn't he, in the trenches that he hadn't felt before. Maybe just as it's been said that some people with serious anxiety and depression problems have actually found during the lockdown that they've been doing better than people who've not been used to this kind of thing.
Yeah.
In a sense, he was already inured to that kind of high level of stress, wasn't he?
He was, and I think also, I don't know how you found it at the Royal College, but there is a sense when you're a music student, particularly a composition student, that you are very isolated and everything is in your head, and that there isn't a structure to life, and he desperately needed a structure because he was someone who is an uncontained personality, and he had to find his exoskeleton outside.
Yes. And there was no social life, I gather, at the Royal College.
Not in those days. I mean, we don't want to do a disservice to the college. It's a great place to be, but
yes.
In those days there was very little, and he was very isolated, and he was desperately poor, and he was away from home, and he was finding he could hold himself together psychologically by all this sort of very extreme exercise and doing the equivalent of aerobics at the time, which was fascinating looking into all that. These kind of physical jerks that he was eulogizing about, and then these long walks through the Gloucestershire countryside and through London at night. But then, of course, the army has routine, and there's a wonderful moment in his letters very early on where he says, I'm tired, but I'm tired with many men. It's not just me, thank God. There are other people. I see my own suffering reflected in the world around me, and it's normalised. And I have comrades, and I can delight in them and listen to their accents.
Celtic ones in particular.
The Celtic ones and the folk songs, and first night in the trenches, he hears Welsh folk song, and that's what he writes about. Never mind what's going on or what's awaiting him.
Yes.
Unlike most of his contemporaries, either poets or composers, he ended his life in an asylum. This makes, particularly given that asylums were in the 20s and 30s, this makes research particularly difficult, doesn't it? I mean, you must have had to do an extraordinary amount of detective work to find out what happened to him in those later years.
Yeah, I became absolutely fascinated and horrified and just utterly absorbed in psychiatry of the 1920s and 30s. This is a whole area that I hadn't expected to be immersed in when I was looking at the poems and songs. But the majority of his adult life is spent locked up, either on a ward or in a single room. And what's so incredible about Gurney is that he keeps writing. So he is a voice from the many thousands of silenced ex-servicemen who returned from the trenches, who were locked up and forgotten about. He tells us something about that, and so the responsibility for me to be able to articulate and present these still unpublished manuscripts and frame them correctly. What does it feel like to be anonymous, to be forgotten, to have your name, to a certain extent replaced by a number, to be writing into a vacuum, ostensibly. And what does it feel like to fight madness, to use your writing and your poetry as a defense against your personality being eroded? It's a very extreme situation. And for him, it's a kind of terrible liberation because he has a total freedom. No one's publishing him, so he can go off the rails. He writes incredible stuff during those years.
Well, you've chosen a song next that, in some ways, a lot of people thought when it did appear that it was him going off the rails. I find it just incredibly compelling. I mean, it's a really difficult balance, isn't it, between music that is psychotic and music that expresses the psychotic state, and that's the difference in a sense. You can feel that in giving form to what he's feeling, he's in some way helping maintain his balance.
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, and this is a song by a beerside, and he's writing it in the trenches in the midst of the First World War, and he says in his letters he writes it in a disused trench mortar emplacement, resting on a sandbag by the light of a stump of candle. And when you hold this manuscript in the archives, it smells of the Somme. It has a huge mud stain across it. Now, what does it mean to be sane under those circumstances? You know, it's full of these kind of overlong pauses, and you can almost hear him sort of tearing his hair because he's trying to work out what it means to die, whether it is grand to die, whether it is noble. And when we hear it, these crashing chords at the end, slightly too many times, it's as if he doth protest too much. But then, and we think of Wilfred Owen and we think of Dulce et decorum est, and of course he's being deeply ironic. It isn't grand to die in winter in the Somme. But then again, he writes a letter saying, in this song, I have in mind proclaiming over the body of some Greek hero dead, and it is grand and it is noble, and so he's wrestling. And what we might, if we wanted to interpret as mad music, is deeply psychologically invested in this impossible tension between the horror of it and the nobility of it, and trying to work out where he sits within it all.
And this is a sacred city built of marvellous earth. He's referring to the body on the bier in front of him.
And he's got bodies out in front of him. Literally,
yes.
He can smell the bodies in no man's land as he's writing it. So when he's talking about marvellous earth, Edward Thomas, the poet, when he was asked why he went to the trenches, why he decided to go to fight, he reached down, got a handful of Gloucestershire soil and said, for this. Gurney knows what he means when he sets the words marvellous earth.
Sarah, would you please introduce us to the beer side?
Death makes the lovely soul
Yeah,
She
in a
just
way.
sits in silence.
But just as Gurney, it seems all the way through that song, everything's a surprise. You know, for me, I've heard that now several times, and I still, the way he just completely wrong foots you, as you said, it's extraordinary. What about for you, the experience of finding out about him? There must have been a few surprises along the way too.
Yes, gosh, I mean, the biggest surprise at the very beginning was how much unpublished material there was. You know, Gurney was, he was known as the best of the young men below the horizon in his lifetime. He was a big figure, and he is a big figure. He's in the anthologies, and he's in the recital programs, but yet there is so much, unlike any other person you could think of who is a well-known writer or composer of the 20th century, there is so much that is still unpublished. And that's being worked on very slowly. It won't always be that way, but it is the most, I mean, it really is a treasure trove. So that was a huge surprise. But then as I got sort of more and more into the research and found people who knew something, particularly of the Asylum years, which was so under-researched, there were all sorts of things that I could trace through the medical notes or through anecdotes that were hugely important. So at one point, I met the archivist of Dartford Asylum, which has now closed in the sort of 80s and 90s. So whenever I've seen it, it's been either being turned into luxury flats, or it now is. It's an extraordinary place. Yeah. But the archivist remembered some very, very old chap in his 90s who just died just before I got to talk to him, called Charlie Day, who'd been the upholsterer's apprentice and had made the Christmas decorations and the fancy dress costumes for the ward balls and things like this. And Charlie had said to her that some bloke called something like Ralph Vaughan Williams used to come in all the time and with other musicians and play through Gurney's songs and his chamber music. Now, of course, that is a game changer for anybody who is assuming that this vast array of unpublished songs and quartets and all sorts of music that Gurney wrote in the Asylum was, as I said, slightly disingenuously being written into a vacuum. Actually, there was a whole kind of outreach scheme running from the Royal College for him, and what he was writing was being looked over by Vaughan Williams and by Arthur Benjamin, the fabulous musicians at the time. And so do we see it as lost and mad and odd, or do we see it as modernist and exciting and cutting edge and pushing boundaries in fabulous and interesting ways? So moments like that make you absolutely revise all the preconceptions, and there are so many preconceptions when there is the stigma of madness across a whole lot of material. Exactly. And what do we do with that? Do we not perform late Schumann because he's bonkers? I mean, that would be unthinkable.
It's a very interesting comparison, because late Schumann has had a total reappraisal in the last 20 years, I think, just as Gurney's star has begun to reason. I think perhaps we are more at ease with the idea of different neuroatypical people.
Absolutely.
And their way of seeing things.
And Gurney is behind the curve. I mean, that's very much where the exciting opportunity for me in my work, that we have come to terms with late Schumann, late Beethoven, Scriabin, fairly out there. But that hasn't yet happened for Gurney, and his work hasn't been heard, hasn't been sort of pulled apart and dissected and performed and recorded and we haven't become acclimatized to it because of this taint of the Asylum. And that is a huge obstacle to overcome.
Do you think another thing might be because people look at some of his titles or the subjects of his songs and think, oh, another English romantic pastoralist? But actually, he's very, very different. I mean, maybe you could tell us a little bit about his relationship to the landscape. This is not just a sort of gentleman's nostalgic pleasure in an idyllic landscape. It's much more than that, isn't it?
So Gurney was very influenced by the Georgian poets, who were very much sort of based in landscape. And he grew up in Gloucester, right in the centre of Gloucester, but at those days only a short bike ride or a short walk out into the Gloucestershire meadows and the hills and to the River Severn. And he was very unhappy at home. So the landscape became his family. The hills are, he says in one poem, friends of mine and kindly. And so this amalgamation of the Georgian poetry influence, the kind of the folk song revival with Holst and Vaughan Williams, and the fact that he adored the landscape, it was closer to him than many humans, means that for Gurney, landscape is in his soul. There's a moment in the trenches where he describes Gloucester as a city in the soul for him, which is a quote. And he takes a little postcard, a very beautiful postcard that I found actually, a photograph taken by a friend of his, I was delighted to find, with the sunlight streaming down over Gloucester Cathedral and the
Bubble bright.
Yes, exactly. And he took it and he put it in a little niche in a dugout in the trenches, and he invited the other Gloucestershire lads to come and see it. And I always sort of was anxious for him, thinking they're going to just think he's nuts, you know, and he's going to. And apparently they worshipped at it like a shrine, and they would burst into tears when they would see it. So this deep, deep love of home and deep love of landscape is what impelled Gurney, and it's what drove him to write across both genres.
Yes, it's often struck me that when he talks about familiar faces, he's talking about those landscapes, you think, actually, is he talking about human faces at all, but the faces of places?
Yeah, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Incredibly. And there's that lovely story you tell of a poet, Edward Thomas's wife, widow, Helen.
Yeah.
Yes, coming to visit him in the asylum and bringing him maps, I think, isn't that right?
Yes, yes.
Were they the three-dimensional maps, the maps with...
Oh, wouldn't that have been wonderful? Flat ordnance survey ones.
That would have been wonderful.
Well, no, yes, pop-up versions of Gloucestershire.
Well, they had the contour lines on, wouldn't they?
Yeah, would have done, and they would have had the little paths and the byways. And
Yeah.
so Helen Thomas, who herself was a beautiful writer, like utterly commend her, the very long-suffering widow of Edward Thomas, who was killed in the trenches and who Gurney revered, although he never met him, came to visit Gurney, astonishingly, in the asylum. She'd never met Gurney, but she was brave enough to go to Dartford because Gurney was setting some of her husband's poetry to music very wonderfully. And she wore her brightest hat to try to be enlivening in this very dingy atmosphere. And she hit upon this wonderful idea after her first visit of bringing him these Ordnance Survey maps of Gloucestershire, because he couldn't ever get out to the landscape that he loved. And in fact, Adeline Vaughan Williams' first wife, had said, wouldn't it just be better? He's so heartbreaking in his insanity. Wouldn't it be better for him to have one day of freedom in this landscape, in the countryside, even if he kills himself? But Helen hit on this idea of bringing the landscape to him, and having not really been able to connect with him before, they traced the paths that both Edward Thomas and Gurney walked separately across the bed in his little room in the asylum.
One of the stories that upset me so much from your book was how they, being a private hospital, they had carte blanche to experiment on patients with, and so do tell us what they went through.
Well, coming back to this idea of what the surprises were, it's very, very easy to see the asylum as a hell on earth. I mean, what a hideous fate for anyone to be locked up in a lunatic asylum for life against your will. And it was. For Gurney, it was a disaster, and it was awful. And yet, it was actually a very impressive place in many ways. There were some fantastic doctors there, with great compassion, mostly overworked, and they were absolutely doing their best. They had almost no medicine to offer him. They had varying diagnoses that didn't achieve very much. There wasn't much they could do apart from maintain him. But one doctor did bring in this experimental treatment from Vienna that was usually used on patients with syphilis, which was to inject them with malaria and to raise their temperature so high that they would be in paroxysms of fever, and that somehow purges the madness. And it kind of does work for syphilis, but it doesn't work for bipolar / schizophrenia / schizoid affective disorder, whatever it is we very tentatively might want to label Gurney with. And what we find is that in his medical notes, in tiny little handwriting, the doctors note that he loses 2 stone over about 6 to 8 weeks, and I quote, the patient is on his knees praying for death. And that little line in the medical notes for me was just heartbreaking. He would have had no say in it. But then again, what else could they do? It might have worked. You know, they were doing their best.
Was sent back to Austria with his tail between
that particular doctor does seem to vanish very quickly, yeah. But then there were other doctors who did make a real difference. And these periods of time where he's writing in a kind of white heat of creativity. There's a wonderful doctor, Dr. Anderson, who spent a lot of time with him, who was a flautist himself, a very literary man. And during that time, Gurney is churning out fantastic music, fantastic poetry. So you know, it was a very, very up and down kind of experience, certainly.
Yes, but he must have missed the countryside beyond.
Desperately.
I mean, it made him ill, just thinking. Marion Scott used to visit him quite a lot.
Yes, yeah. She was a friend of his from the Royal College and great supporter, and ended up being his executor. And she would go and visit. But again, there is a little book, a lot of the archives are flood damage from the asylum, but there is a little book with a sort of register of visitors, and a bit like an old school register with sort of graph paper and crosses. And you can see how many crosses there are year by year as to who's visiting him, and for 6 months at a time, there's no cross. So it was a,
Could you tell us about the next song that you've chosen, Desire in Spring? Because knowing Gurney, this is not what you'd normally expect of a romantic poetry. He's talking about a desire of a different kind, in a sense.
Yes. Well, Sarah could tell us a little bit more about it, and
Sarah,
also
please.
sing it. But this is one that Gurney wrote back in 1918. Sort of, he'd been discharged from the army, and he spent New Year in Zennor in Cornwall. And again, a very different landscape from the Gloucestershire daffodil fields and orchards. But he'd managed to climb himself up a little chimney of rock at Gurnard's Head, and was so fascinated by the turbulent waves beneath him that he wrote the setting of Francis Ledwidge's poem Desire in Spring, but also lost track of time and got stuck.
Yes,
So the party, the walking party he was with, realised some hours later that there was no sign of him and it was getting dark, and had to go and rescue him along with this manuscript paper.
Yes, I don't want to describe the song, it says it all. Really.
It's just very beautiful, and it moves. It has the movement of the sea somehow in it.
Yes.
Gurney can be very much at a walking pace, because very often he's writing as he walks, and this has a different energy about it.
And
doesn't it?
I've been told, and I've sort of absolutely believe in this rubato in the piano writing, that when he writes a group of notes, like 8 in a row, he never wants them played mechanically or machine line. He wants them always to have this movement and this rubato.
Yeah.
And I feel that this song in particular brings life and freshness to the music.
Yeah.
And I feel that also when I'm singing Schumann again.
Oh, interesting.
I feel that even Zwielicht, the famous Schumann song, no note is ever mathematically the same as the next. There's always movement to depict emotion, I suppose.
And of course, Gurney adored Schubert and Schumann and cut his teeth on them, playing them on the piano in a friend's house in Gloucester. So perhaps that's something he takes from Schumann.
Yes.
That movement.
He was
and
called
freedom.
Little Schubert, wasn't he?
Little Schubert, yes, he looked like Schubert. His handwriting was like Schubert, his glasses were like Schubert. And Parry, who was the director of the Royal College at the time, had received these manuscripts ready for his scholarship interview. And Gurney walked into the room, and Parry said, "By God, it is Schubert," because he looks a lot like him. But absolutely.
comparison with Schumann because you suddenly reminded me as you were singing there of something a friend composer friend of mine said about Schumann. He said, it's when he smiles that he really breaks your heart. And there's something about those seemingly contented little figures at the end that is almost too sad to bear. It's extraordinary, isn't it? Well, to this last period of his that you found out so much about, Kate, which is so extraordinary to read, do you think his incarceration was a disaster or a liberation or both?
Yeah, I think it was both. I think from the point of view of this incredible music and his mature poetry, he wrote so many poems that we have still yet to see in the Asylum. They wouldn't have been the same in a different situation. Whether that sacrifice is worth it, I'm sure Gurney wouldn't agree, but you know, he managed, because he was driven to write, he was hurt into poetry, he was forced to write, and he couldn't afford not to. It was the only way he could hold on to his identity, and it was the only thing he had to fight madness, effectively. And he had an enormous time to do it in. He had no obligation to earn a living. He was fed, he was housed. Whereas before the Asylum, he was taking jobs as a cold storage worker for 2 weeks, or a cinema pianist and getting sacked almost as soon as he'd unpacked, you know, and picking up stones from farmyards. I mean, just kind of anything, you know. So he had this opportunity, and he had a deep-seated need to write, and a freedom to do it, and a freedom to associate and to live in his past. And that's one of the other fascinating things. As a writer and as a composer, if you have no future, how does that affect your work? He starts to repeat his life over and over again, which, of course, to a biographer is completely fascinating. It's like reading a perpetual posthumous autobiography. So alongside the poems and the letters, alongside the poems and the music, there's this huge body of writing that we call the letters of appeal, which are, you know, a thing particular to Gurney, where he writes endlessly to figures of authority, Metropolitan Police, the army of back home, the women of New England, you name it. Gurney's addressing them, University of Durham, the Rhodes Scholar of Christchurch. I mean, most of them unposted, unaddressed, no stamp. But he rehearses his life fact by fact, and he selects the events that he feels are important to him. And so that, to me, is fascinating, because he is telling me something about what it feels like to be Gurney, how he feels about his own identity, when there is no future to look forward to. And he remains a war poet through the 20s, and what other poet keeps writing war poetry that is that alive and that present?
And he's in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey.
Absolutely, he is, and that identity was hugely important to him as a war poet. He thought very, very hard about that during his time in the Asylum, and ranked himself. He tried out different sort of pecking orders of war poets, and as nobody contradicted him, he got higher and higher in his own pecking order. Why not, you know?
Could you tell us a little bit about this tiny but incredibly poignant song that you've chosen to end with, Seven Meadows? He wrote this in the trenches, didn't he?
Yes. Now, in fact, Sarah sent me an email the other day saying, why is this the only song where Gurney sets his own poetry? And I'd say, well, it almost is. It almost is. There are actually about 12 songs where Gurney says them. Almost all of them are unpublished. And he writes them under pseudonyms, but this is the only one that we really know and that is published, where Gurney wrote a very little, sort of almost throwaway poem in the trenches and sent it back in a letter to Marion Scott and called it Song. And then about a week later, he set it to music. So there's something very, very particularly intense about it, because it is a perfect synthesis of thought and across words and music. And it's like a little suicide note, or it's a goodbye. And it's the thing that breaks my heart about it is the humility of it. It's as James Doherty said, it is where the quote "dweller in shadows" comes from. Only the wanderer knows England's graces, and can anew see clear familiar faces. And who loves joy as he that dwells in shadows? Do not forget me quite, O Seven Meadows.
Terribly moving.
It is so poignant and so understated, and a lovely way to finish. Thank you.
Everything is an honour to sing, truly it is, but I cannot tell you as a singer, and Ian will know this too, Ian Partridge over there, to sing Gurney's music is one of the greatest honours of our lives, certainly of mine, especially when I go abroad and include him in recitals in all sorts of strange and fun places, northern Spain, or little villages tucked away in various places, and they always come up to me and say, that music, that song. They're looking at the translation of it and they say, you clearly really identify with this. Even though I sing Howells and Britain, whatever, it's this music that is not just me, it's the music itself. It has the power to communicate to the deepest part of the soul.
And you communicate it so wonderfully. I mean, you are one of the very, very great exponents, and Ian Partridge as well, of course, but you've done so much for Gurney to raise his profile and to champion him. So
well, the window the Ivor Gurney window in Gloucester Cathedral was something I never imagined would happen.
Yeah.
But Tom Denny did the most wonderful set of drawings for that. So it's just an honour to be associated with your book, Kate. It's fantastic. And we're also lucky to have this book.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but thank you very much. You go up.
I'm so sorry to intrude upon such distinguished and esteemed company. I'm Ben Tate from Princeton University Press, Kate's publisher. My colleagues and I are delighted to join in this celebration of what is so obviously a monumental achievement, one with the publication of which Princeton are so enormously proud to be associated, of course. Holding gifts with purpose, I'd like to join Kate in extending heartfelt thanks to our chief protagonists this evening, Dame Sarah, Stephen, and Simon. Thanks ever so much. It was wonderfully rich and interesting, hauntingly beautiful, just stunningly beautiful. Thanks ever so much. And fittingly appropriate as a celebration for Kate's book. So thank you very much. An enormous privilege and pleasure to have published Kate's book. As you've now learned, this book for Kate wasn't the work of an afternoon. I would call it a long twilight struggle. If such didn't imply that ultimate triumph didn't await you upon completion. I think it was suggested on Radio 3 the week before last that this was the work of a war correspondent because it seemed like Kate was there. I don't think that's hyperbole. I think literally she was there. There's no other explanation for it. I can't imagine that anything else about Gurney could ever be disclosed or excavated.
That sounds like an invitation to a million other people to write to correct my inaccuracy.
And you heard it here first. The second volume will be published momentarily. Kate's work has been distinguished by an unstinting faithfulness to subject from beginning to end. Her aim has been to do justice to Gurney and give us a Gurney in the round in a full three dimensions. And again, we're just enormously proud to be associated with the book. It's a book without precedent and a book which is unlikely to be superseded anytime soon. So Kate, thank you ever so much. And by a shocking coincidence, we happen to have books for sale here tonight. And I believe in purchasing the book that you can make a donation to the Oxford Center for Life Writing, which is the center which Kate calls home, and about which I believe she'll say something now.
Thank you so much, Ben.
And thanks everyone for being here.
I know you've all heard far too much from me, and that there are canapes and far more exciting things coming up any minute now. But I did just want to extend my thanks very briefly to Princeton for making this possible and for being the most fantastic publishers anyone could possibly have. They've stood by me with enormous patience and been terribly supportive, so I've been really very lucky. And of course to my wonderful, wonderful colleagues, what a huge honour And also to Richard Heason and to Simon, co-directors of Smith Square here, who very, very kindly run around to an inordinate degree to make this possible for me. I'm enormously grateful. Now, I would just tell you the tiniest little bit, and I promise I won't be long, about the Oxford Centre for Life Writing, because it's a very deep passion of mine. I'm the Associate Director of the Centre, and this evening is in aid of our work in the community there. And the thing that Simon always says to me, because he is not an academic and is in the real world, is what on earth is life writing? So I thought I would just tell you, it's a term coined by Virginia Woolf, so it can't be completely ridiculous. And she means biography, but it's also much more than that. It's memoir and diaries and letters, but it's also drama and opera and dance. In fact, it's any way that anyone tells the story of a life. And it's the only one discipline that really links across anything you can think of. So we talk across English and music, and philosophy and anthropology, medicine, science. And the Oxford Centre for Life Writing has its home at the wonderful Wolfson College in Oxford, part of Oxford University. We are there a centre for world-leading research and bringing together the very greatest of great writers and academics across the world. And we're talking globally all the time for talks and podcasts and conferences and discussions, publications, all of which are accessible to the general public. So we have people who've been to our events who've never been to university and have come to sometimes 2 or 3 things a week for 7 years or so with us. And so we have a very close-knit family. And everything we do is accessible to absolutely everyone, homeschooled, sixth formers, you name it. We have people in our community who are enormously diverse. We inspire young writers, we support early career academics, 1 or 2 of whom are here today. And the college provides a very splendid auditorium for us and offices, but we need financial support to continue the work we're doing, both in academia and very crucially in the community. Now, it may be reasonable to ask why the world needs life writing. Well, as I say, we bring together the best writers and thinkers in the field alongside the public, sometimes people beginning to write for the very first time. And we think about people's lives and how they experience them and how they articulate them. And the bigger point is that the more we listen, the more we really listen to each other and put ourselves in others' shoes, the more we can improve tolerance and social cohesion. In Gurney's case, if we can understand what his life was like, we have a context for his work. We can read his work as a way into the closed world of the asylum, which is what I hoped to do. And similarly, at the Life Writing Centre in Oxford, we have projects helping to show medics different ways of reading and paying attention to the way patients narrate their experiences of illness. If we can use literary analysis to ask different questions, to encourage creative ways of telling a life story, we can nuance our understanding of it, and we can improve how we respond to it. We can actually improve medical outcomes, ultimately, potentially. We can make connections across cultures, across history, and across social divides. Life writing is unique, and it has more potential than any other discipline I can think of to reach people. We all need to understand who we are and why our lives are as they are, and have the confidence to articulate our identity. And we need to be curious, and we need to be empathetic about others. And in a world where children are growing up more and more in social media echo chambers, we can use life writing and the creativity at the heart of it to help them imagine themselves out of themselves, and to take them into others' lives, to question and to develop imagination. And that's what we're trying to do. We're currently working with a school, in particular, a school for children with special needs, that's very strong on core subjects, but the children don't have access to drama, music, and literature at a high level. We want to continue our work with them, watching really special children finding new ways to access literature when reading is really hard for them, to be able to bring them a flavour of the ideas that we're so lucky to have around us in Oxford and that we're so privileged to be able to share in an evening like this. As I said, for Gurney, writing was his only defence against the asylum and against illness, and his work was defined by that. I mean, his life and work was defined by that struggle, but what held him together was his ability to be creative, to articulate his sense of self to the world. And he had everything stacked against him. And for many of these children that we work with, life isn't straightforward. They have many, many obstacles to overcome. But being able to share the joy of words, of ideas, of theatre and music with them is something that takes them to another place, and it takes us to another place too. It's a huge privilege, and to watch them grow in confidence. And it's a privilege that we'd really welcome your support to be able to continue and to be able to grow on the work that we've already done. So thank you all very, very much for coming. I'm so honoured to be able to share the publication of my book with you all. And if you would obviously like to buy a copy, a percentage of every book you buy tonight will be donated to our work in the community at the Life Writing Centre. However, if you would like to make a donation over and above that, that is also more than fine. And just talk to the lovely people with the card machines, and they will be able to put in any figure, however many noughts you like. Please don't hold back. It's no problem. It's a very big screen. Also in the books are leaflets about how to join our Friends scheme. We have quite a new and very thriving Friends of OCLW, as we call ourselves. We know and love each one of our friends. We have a lovely book club all together. We have lots of special events like this, just for our friends. And every single person who contributes, really from a very small amount a month, makes the most enormous difference to us and enables us to keep working. So in each book there is a little leaflet about the Friends scheme. Do please consider joining. If everybody joined, we would be able to achieve the most enormous amount. So talk to me more about the centre. Have a lovely evening. I'd be delighted to continue this conversation with anybody. And above all, I'm just so terribly grateful for all your support, and enjoy your canapes. Thank you very much indeed.